Welcome to the 11th episode of Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. That's right, 11 episodes. It's taken me this long to figure out how to stop that puffing sound whenever I say a P or a B in the microphone. But then again, no one ever said I was a quick learner. After all, I was dropped on my head at one point when I was eating paint chips as a child, so I attribute all of my learning deficiencies to that one experience. This is a board gaming podcast where I talk about board games. Naturally, we do reviews and discussion about different board games, and that's what we're going to be doing here today. Today we'll be doing the normal schedule where I talk about a couple of games I've played recently. Then we're going to move into our review of the day, which this week is Caverna, with a focus on the solo mode. As a quick reminder for those who are familiar with the podcast, or as a quick PSA for those who are brand new, we don't discuss the rules in depth here on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. We try to save the discussion for the games themselves, and so I will be placing some links in the description of this video or this podcast that go to content creators who have created videos that teach the games that I'm going to be talking about today. Please, if you feel like you'd like to know more about a game before listening to my thoughts, feel free to check out one of those videos. They're fantastic. You'll learn everything you need to know about how to play a game just from watching one of those great videos. And with that being said, we're moving on to the first game of the week. That game is Galaxy Trucker, designed by Vlada Chavatil, which I mispronounce every time I say it. I'm sorry, Vlada. And it is published by Czech Games Edition. Now, Vlada Chavatil, again, I'm sorry, is a man who is probably the most famous name in board games, even if nobody knows it. What I mean by that is his designs are so prominent and so varied that you're just as likely to find one of his titles in a collection of a complete board game newbie as you are in the collection of a hardened veteran. Really, he's got incredible range as a designer. For years, he was known for his games like Through the Ages, Dungeon Lords, or Mage Knight, these heavy, medium-heavy Euro games. And then a couple years ago, he came along and just dropped Codenames on the world, which has become the biggest Smash party hit within the last, 4 or 5 years or so. A game that pretty much everybody knows. But because his range is so diverse and so wide, Vlad is the kind of designer that's going to have hits and misses for each person, even though he's a top-notch designer. And I bring all this up as a way of introducing Galaxy Trucker, because Galaxy Trucker is a game that's not just a hit and miss with people in general, but somehow, for me, it's simultaneously both a hit and a miss. Galaxy Trucker is the kind of game that really relies on a couple of conditions for me, and maybe for other people, to really enjoy. The first is you have to be the kind of gamer that doesn't mind just watching things fall apart no matter what you do. You know, the kind of gamer that doesn't mind sitting back, cracking a can of whatever you're drinking, and then watching mayhem ensue across the game board. The second condition is you have to be in the right mindset to let that happen. See, I would qualify myself as being a person that doesn't mind those chaotic situations. I don't mind just doing stuff in a game and seeing what happens. In fact, I feel like that's the best way to learn a game. I'm not one of those players that's big on knowing everything I can do on a turn before taking an action. I don't mind just doing things and seeing what comes of it. As a result, I do enjoy programming games. Games like Robo Rally. Games where you devise a plan as best as you can, but then you just have to kind of hope for the best. Your robot's going to either do exactly what you said or complete none of the things that you'd planned for it. Galaxy Trucker takes that randomness of what might happen though and it dials it up to 11. Best put, Galaxy Trucker is a real-time, tile-laying, spaceship building game where you have a furious rush for the first phase to assemble tiles in your ship in a way that you think is going to give you some semblance of success in the second phase. And then the second phase starts and you're pretty much hands-off as you watch terrible things happen to the ship that you've just built. Now, this game is quick, it's lighthearted, and at its core, it's basically a beer and pretzels game. It's not the kind of game you can plan or strategize too heavily in. It's not the kind of game you can take too seriously. And sometimes that's just what you want. But there's often times where that's not what you want. And it can be an irritating experience to see your ship suddenly destroyed by the second card in phase 2, and then you're suddenly behind everybody else. On my most recent play, I had an idea for a potentially interesting variant where in the second phase, instead of just automatically participating in every card that gets flipped over, it could be interesting if you had a chance to choose whether you wanted to participate in an event before a card gets flipped. I know there's probably some diehards out there that are wanting to string me up now for even mentioning something like this, but it could add an interesting push your luck strategy to that second phase, that event phase. If you choose to skip out on an event, you might miss the pirates and avoid getting attacked by pirates. but you just as likely might miss a planet, where you can get cargo, which is the primary way to score lots of points. It could also maybe give you a bit more direction when you're building your ship too. Maybe a ship that focuses entirely on lasers for whatever reason, and then you choose to skip some events in the hope that you don't hit pirates. I don't know. That element of this variant isn't thought through very well, I admit. But I like the idea of having a little bit more control over what happens in that second phase. This is, of course, something that would work much better as a variant than as an actual standard house rule, because there's a good case for the hilarity that ensues when everything goes to pieces. I've played this game a few times now, and I've had plenty of games where I was happy to just see what happens, and then I've had games where I obviously just wasn't in the mood for that kind of a game, and realistically, I probably should have just played something else. Anyway, that was Galaxy Trucker by Vlada Shavtil. It's something that I'm sure I'll play again in the future. I'd love to play some of the expansions. Nobody in our group has the expansions yet, but I'd love to try those out. And I will be exploring that design more in the future, I'm sure. Moving on to the next game, I had a chance to play Role Player, designed by Keith Majetka, and it is published by Thunderworks Games. Now, Role Player is a game that's essentially defined entirely by its concept. I remember hearing about it for the first time a few years ago, and I knew I had to play it sometime. It's a dice drafting game where the entire goal is to create a fantasy RPG style character. That's it, that's the whole game. You create your character. You don't go on quests, you don't do anything else. You just create a character, and that's the entire game. And that's a cool idea. Now, I like Role Player, and I think I like it pretty well, but I can understand the views of those who don't like it because this is a very specific kind of game. I had wanted to play it for years. I finally bit the bullet and bought the game myself, put my money where my mouth was, after reading that Role Player is essentially a gamier version of Sagrada. Fortunately for me, that's exactly what I was looking for. Sagrada, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a light dice drafting game where you're drafting a beautiful set of colored dice to create an abstract depiction of a stained glass window. It's a great light experience, one of the games I recommended in my podcast for holiday games. And Role Player is just a step up from that. It's a heavier version of Sagrada with a number of additional systems that are mixed into the basic gameplay. Whereas in Sagrada, you're just drafting dice for your window. In Role Player, you aren't just drafting dice, you've also got a market of cards that you're buying from that give you special bonuses. The turn order for buying from that market is determined from the value of the dice you draft. There's also a series of special abilities that activate based on where you place your dice on your board. There's a number of skills you can acquire that allow you to do various things. And there are variable asymmetrical player powers that change up every time you play. And all this sounds very good, and it is, but what's interesting about Role Player is despite all these additional systems added on top of it, it's actually less puzzlier than its lighter cousin Sagrada. This mainly comes from the fact that Sagrada has a very firm set of restrictions on where you can place dice when you draft them. You have to start on the edges of your card. You can't place them anywhere in the template to begin with. You have to start on one of the outer edges. You can't place two of the same number or two of the same color dice next to each other. They can be diagonal but not adjacent. And you have to match the spaces on the little stained glass card that you've got. Every card's got a number of spaces on it that tell you whether you need to place a certain color or a certain number in a certain spot. All of this culminates over the course of the game into an interesting little thought puzzle, as you're free to place dice at the beginning of the game pretty much anywhere you want around the edges. But as the rounds go on, you find yourself starting to hate your past self for the awful decisions you've made. All of a sudden, you find yourself very, very limited as the game starts to come to a close on where you can place your dice. So you have to be kind of strategic about how you're placing dice from the beginning of the game, and you have to be trying to plan ahead as best as you can. And to top all this off, you can easily scale the difficulty of Sagrada based on what kind of stained glass template card you take. Role Player, though, for all the additional systems it adds to this core gameplay, it falls short in the actual dice placement bit. The bit that's actually got a nice little crunchy bite to it in Sagrada. The only restriction on where you can place dice on your board is that it must be placed in the far left-hand space of whatever row you place it in. After that, anything is fair game. Now, you do get some scoring criteria that will inform your decisions. For example, getting specific combined die values in a certain row, or getting specific die colors in specific spots. But none of these are really restrictions so much as they're just scoring incentives. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does make gameplay much simpler. In fact, it almost seems like it's more common for players to match all their goals than not when playing Role Player, and that's a bit of a shame. And it's in this way that it's actually a simpler game than Sagrada, even though it's not the game that I would take home to play with my family just because of how much extra stuff there is that you have to keep track of. So in short, I've liked Role Player, and I like Sagrada, but I'd love to see a game that's more of a marriage between the two. I've read that having one or two of the expansions for Role Player really shakes things up, so I'm interested in picking one of those up in the future. I just haven't had a chance to do it yet. Next up is our game of the week. This game is Caverna. It is designed by Uwe Rosenberg and it is published by Lookout Games. Oh, Caverna. I really, really like Caverna. I know it seems like kind of a strange topic for today, considering it's the third week of the month, which means we're due for a solo game. But with Thanksgiving around the corner, it seemed like a great opportunity to try out the solo version for a game that's basically about growing vegetables and breeding animals. Caverna has been one of my favorite worker placement games for quite a while now. To me, it's a prime example of what a sandbox board game can be. It's a game that establishes a set of restrictions, gives you a pair of goals, which in this case is score points and feed your dwarves, and then it basically drops you off with a host of toys to play with and figure out the best way to accomplish the goals it's given you. In fact, this is the reason why I prefer Caverna to Agricola. Agricola is a great game, but I really prefer the sense of freedom that Caverna gives. Which kind of leads into the solo version, actually. Caverna doesn't have a dedicated solo mode, or rather, it doesn't have an automata type deck that simulates the actions of another player. Instead, it's purely a score optimization exercise. There are a couple minor adjustments to the game, but primarily you're playing with the two-player rules with a pair of minor revisions to them. Now, I can't say I'm overly fond of solo systems that operate this way. If I'm just optimizing my score against myself, I might as well play a video game of some sort. True, there's a certain satisfaction you get from manipulating physical pieces to a game, but it seems like an exercise in futility to simply sit there unopposed and try to score as many points as you can, particularly when vying for action spaces is a big part of most worker placement games, and Caverna is no exception. In fact, that was one of the roadblocks I had to overcome while playing this solo. I kept trying to plan my turns around what other players might do, and then I'd have to stop myself and remember that it was just me playing and I could do whatever I want. Which sort of leads me to my major point when it comes to Caverna as a solo game. Perhaps what surprised me most about playing Caverna solo is I actually really enjoyed my time with it, much more than I thought I would. When I first set it up, I figured I'd play one game and then come back to it the next day and try it again, but I ended up playing it 3 times in a row the first night. I'd wrap up a game, see a room I'd forgotten about, and then start all over again as I wanted to try a new strategy that had just cropped up in my mind. The fact that there are so many options available to you and so many potential combos is what really makes this experience. And that's even if you don't include the asymmetrical powers from the Forgotten Folk expansion, which is excellent and I highly recommend to anybody that's got the base game. I had a great time trying out rooms I've never tried before and seeing how quickly and efficiently I could hit specific goals, like getting that first worker or filling up my board. I've had a strategy bouncing around in the back of my brain for years now that I never got a chance to try, so I tried that out in one of my solo games. It didn't work, but it was fun to see what happened. And overall, I had a great time playing the solo version. Up until a point. See, there's 2 inherent problems with this type of solo mode. The first is that you're eventually going to figure out the highest, most optimized score. The highest you can get, the best you can do. Now, that may not happen very quickly, and I suspect with Caverna you could play it a lot of times before you get to that point. Although you're going to quickly reach a point where you're basically batting around the same average. But that leads into the second biggest issue, which is that the more you play a game like this solo, the more nobody's ever going to want to play this game with you. And maybe understandably so. The more familiar you are with the game, the more likely you are to just trounce everybody else at the table. Reasonably, I think most gamers would agree that winning in this way is actually very boring, but even if you go out of your way to try new strategies every time, you're still going to have knowledge that the rest of the group doesn't have, and you're going to have an edge over everybody else. Now, if you've got a hyper-competitive group and everyone's always researching new strategies and trying to get a leg up on the competition when you're not sitting around the table, maybe this is fine. I don't have a group that does that, and honestly, I probably wouldn't be interested in a group that plays that way, but to each their own. I personally run into the same issue with Terra Mystica. I really like Terra Mystica. It's a game I wish I could play more. Unfortunately, I don't have 5 people around regularly, especially in COVID times right now where our game groups are basically interrupted entirely. And so I often have thought about playing online or getting the app and playing by myself, But if I do that, and after just, a handful of games, I'm going to instantly be more experienced and more aware of what's going on than everybody else in my group, to where when we sit down and play, it's going to be a completely unfair advantage. Now, Caverna is not the same kind of game as Terra Mystica. It's not as hyper competitive as that game is, but still, I wouldn't want anybody else at the table to feel like I was winning the game just because I had spent 5 to 10 hours playing the game solo just to figure everything out by myself. One other problem that Caverna's solo mode suffers from is what I like to call setup tax. Setup tax is something that can rear its ugly head regardless of the game you play or the number you're playing with, but it's particularly troublesome when you're considering playing games solo. With a group, when you're setting up a game, you can split up the task amidst several people, and it makes the process far less arduous. But when you're playing solo, you're the only one doing it. And with Caverna, yeah, if you've seen the components in the game, you're going to know it's a problem, because there are so many dang pieces. Seriously, I think every copy of the game requires 2 full trees to make. Now, if you've got an insert, then this really cuts back on that quite a bit, and actually this is one of the games that I really recommend an insert for. I've got one by Folded Space, which is fantastic and can be bought relatively cheaply. It's available on Miniature Market these days, so I'd highly recommend looking into it. It makes setting up so much quicker. You basically open the box, pull out the trays, pull out the boards, and then once you've got the room tile set up, you're ready to go. It takes a 15-minute game to set up and turns it into like 3 or 4 minutes. It's really great. Not that there's any relation between me and Folded Space, of course, it's just a product that I have that I'd highly recommend. What the insert doesn't stop, though, is it doesn't stop upkeep tax. Now, upkeep tax is a lot like setup tax, but it happens during, yep, you got it. It happens during upkeep. Lots of Euro games have upkeep or in-between rounds where you're basically just updating tracks, seeding the board, things like that. Caverna utilizes upkeep tax in a big way, in that after every round you have to put new pieces out on the board, new resources. Again, in a multiplayer game, this isn't that big of a deal. You assign everybody a specific category, and once a round ends, everybody puts the pieces out on the spots they're responsible for, and that's it, you keep playing. In a solo game, though, you're doing that by yourself. And something that you don't really think about is how much you're going to be doing that. In a multiplayer game, 4-player game, everyone's going to be placing 2 dwarfs out during the first round. After everybody is placed, that's a total of 8 actions, then you clear the board, and you seed the board with new resources. And it feels like a fine natural progression. In a solo game, though, you place 2 workers out, usually one right after the other because you've got some plan you're going towards. Then you reset the board, and you seed it, and the round probably lasted a whole 15 seconds. As a result, there's this bizarre anti-flow to the game where for the first half or so, you're basically taking 2 quick actions, then you're having to pause to put a whole bunch of stuff back out on the board, and then you keep going. Naturally, as you play, you'll start to get into the flow of this, and you can start seeding much more quickly as you're going to be more familiar with where things go, but that doesn't really change the constant breaks in pace very much, and it can get a little bothersome after a while. My final issue I have with Caverna's solo mode is ultimately the goal. The rulebook says that you should be shooting for the magic number, and that magic number is 100 points. You should be playing to try to hit that magic number. Now, this is a great idea for a system like this. It's giving you a goal to shoot for. The problem is that goal really isn't set very high, in that I hit the goal of my 3rd play, which kind of shut down that fun initial incentive to try to hit a high score. Now, admittedly, I came into the solo mode with a firm understanding of the options and the systems, and for somebody just starting out with the game, getting to that point may be a more fulfilling experience. Though I suppose that leads me to my ultimate point, which is I love Caverna, and I was surprised how much I liked the solo version, but I would 100% not recommend picking this game up if you're focused on the solo mode. I suppose that may not be a big surprise, as the game clearly wasn't intended for pure solo play, but considering the hefty price tag it comes with, if you're looking for a pure solo game, focus your attention somewhere else. Unless, of course, you've got plenty of disposable income and you're really just jonesing for something that will let you explore lots of options while optimizing your score. Because the game really does offer that in spades, and if that's just what you're looking for, then this could be a good option for you. For anybody else, though, if you're in the market for an interesting sandboxy worker placement game, then I highly recommend picking it up. And definitely look at picking up the Forgotten Folk expansion because of the incredible amount of replayability it adds to the game that realistically already commands an impressive amount of replayability. This is a game that I have played a lot of times. It's not the most played game in my collection, but it's up there. And every time I play, I look at rooms that I haven't tried yet. I think of combos I haven't tried yet. But yeah, definitely check it out. It's a great game. I enjoy it quite a bit. And that's Caverna, designed by Uwe Rosenberg and published by Lookout Games. Well, that is it for another week of Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Ryan Krim. I think I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning yet again. Please feel free to email me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com or tweet me at LYORules if you'd like to get in touch with me. And if not, please stay home this weekend so you don't get the awful COVID. Play board games on your computer, play board games with anybody that you live with. Just avoid the outdoors as much as possible. Have a great weekend. And you know what we say? Game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.